Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to ask a question. I have a question. I'm Francis Kachure from Malawi, Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs. I'm the Assistant Director in the Data Need Management Division of the Ministry of Finance in Malawi. I have one question. Doc, in your conclusion, you highlighted the importance and the advantage of actually developing the domestic debt market. You gave an example to say one of the advantages of actually developing the domestic debt market is that it is an alternative for external borrowing, and that it also facilitates private sector growth. Now my question is, when government borrows heavily from the domestic market, I'm meant to believe that there's a crowding out effect in that the private sector is actually like hindered in growing because the government is borrowing heavily domestically. So I wanted to find out how can you balance up this so that this issue of crowding out effect is not there. Thank you, Doc.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Znaïdi Noema, je suis ministère des Finances au Maroc. J'ai travaillé plusieurs années sur la dette domestique. Donc, j'ai plutôt un commentaire d'abord sur l'expérience du Maroc. Et ces recettes que vous avez présentées, je tiens d'abord à saluer le conférencier pour la consistance de son intervention. Et vraiment, ces recettes qui ont été données, ils marchent. Le Maroc a adopté ces éléments, tous ces éléments, le développement du marché monétaire, le marché primaire, le marché secondaire, les intermédiaires en valeur du trésor qui permettent d'avoir plus de liquidités sur le marché, la base des investisseurs et l'infrastructure du marché, et aussi en parallèle, tous ces briques ont été mis en parallèle. Mais sinon, moi j'ai une observation. Pour certains pays, comment commencer? Parce que on ne peut pas mettre tout en même temps. Le Maroc a mis beaucoup de temps pour avoir une situation de marché domestique qui est liquide et qui permet de financer l'essentiel de ses besoins. En 1998, on avait plus de dettes extérieures que de dettes intérieures. On avait un encours de la dette extérieure de 80-20. Maintenant, on a l'inverse. On est à 20-80. Et donc, mais ça a pris beaucoup de temps. Par exemple, le dépositaire central qui garantit qui garantit pour les titres, il a été créé en 1997, par exemple. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a beaucoup de choses qui ont été créées progressivement. Et c'est cette progressivité qu'il faut mettre en avant, et c'est le cas de chaque pays. Il faut qu'il voit quelles choses il peut mettre, et c'est surtout aussi l'implication des intermédiaires en valeur du trésor qui ont permis de contribuer à l'amélioration du fonctionnement du marché. Merci.
Merci, Monsieur le présentateur, pour la qualité de la présentation. Je suis Moussa Diaré de la République de Guinée. Je voudrais remettre un peu le contexte de votre présentation, c'est-à-dire pour le cas de mon pays. C'est-à-dire, je me demande souvent, un pays qui n'a d'investisseurs institutionnels que les banques, comment ce pays peut prétendre, c'est-à-dire créer un marché secondaire? Ça, c'est une préoccupation que je voudrais partager avec vous. Je voudrais aussi vous demander, vous avez parlé du cas du Nigeria, qui n'a eu un bureau de dette qu'en 2006. Je voudrais savoir, avant 2006, comment le Nigeria faisait. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Mine is a short comment and based on the experience of Ghana. And let me congratulate Prof for this very sequential outline, and I think it's very good for those who are considering it. As with Morocco, Ghana established the stock exchange. In fact, 2 years ago, the stock exchange was 30 years old. So that is a ERP SAP institution. The SEC was established along those lines. The central bank continued to be the issuer of government bonds. And so both the primary markets, the dealings and were established only in 2015. Now, by the time the corporate fixed income bond was put on the market, there was already corporate bonds by the private sector, which was already trading. So there was some kind of experience, along the way. So it made it quite smooth. Interestingly, within 5 years, the government fixed income, the government bonds had become the largest of the fixed income market on the stock exchange. Now, those are positive things that were going on. One of the things that happened also was because Ghana was doing the bond, and I'm saying this out of the experience of Ghana because this is a factor in the default, which should be a lesson for. So the first thing that happened was non-residents started investing heavily in the domestic bond. And at a point, about 60% of the domestic bonds were actually held by non-resident investors, many of whom were buying our sovereign bonds. So issues of arbitrage, issues of, because we saw it in 2015, clearly, because they would either bid or not bid, the big ones, not bid on the external because they were holding, and if it failed, they would come in and rake high interest rates and the rest. Now, the second point about that is it's therefore diluted the distinction between external and domestic bonds. And I have advocated, based on Ghana's experience, that we should have a hybrid. Because when they are coming in through their banks, they bring in Forex. You spend the Forex, sometimes you don't even keep it at it's not even at the central bank, it's with the banks. But when they are exiting, then it's government that has to provide, the Forex. So the management of Forex alongside, this is very, very important. Because this was one of the things that led to the run on the domestic market. Now, from that lesson, if we have a hybrid in our debt classification, where the portion of domestic bonds that are heavily Forex-backed could be treated as external debt and managed the same way we manage the external debt, so that the domestic bond, which is cedis, can be managed as such. I think it will be a stable source of, flows, a stable source of even Forex flows for commercial projects. Right. At a point in time, I think that was the direction, which the market, was going. Now, because of the pressures of the external and the domestic, and particularly the government therefore had to create a repayment. That's what the sinking fund I was talking about, because the piling of external and domestic was moving too fast. So part of oil revenue was dedicated towards, keeping it within the band. Okay. So it's a confluence of all these factors and the pressures that has led to the default, by Ghana. One of the consequences, which I like to warn, and this is my last one, against, is that the pension funds, which didn't have an avenue for investments, went into heavily. And they became very heavy. We have both private pension funds and the haircuts that are taking place domestic has affected the same, those bonds, which is a very big, it strikes a very big blow in the confidence of building the domestic bond market. And as we speak, it is not possible to issue the 3 and 5 year bonds and the longer bonds, which were being issued, 10 year, 7 year, and then others. So I just like to go along, what you have said, and then use Ghana's example, as a market that's, developed well, was developing well. But I think there should have been enough TA at a point to look at the dynamics of the market, and to guide it, accordingly. Finally, one of the experiences which I'd like to share was in building the market. There was a lot of pro bono, surprisingly, from the banks. There were 3 banks, Barclays at the time, now ABSA, Stanbic, Stanchart in particular. They provided pro bono in terms of building the primary market, and the secondary market, and even they brought in experts from the Middle East, in London to come and help in the effort, Bank of America, Europe. So there is enough goodwill for particular middle-income countries that want to go. But I think that moving hastily and fast and not evaluating critically what was happening in the middle could also lead to a very major setback. So this is just my contribution based on Ghana's experience.
Bonjour. Merci pour l'exposé qui a été très brillant. Je suis de la RDC et dans le cadre de notre dette domestique, elle est constituée en majorité d'arriérés budgétaires et nous voulons procéder à la titrisation de ces arriérés budgétaires. Nous sommes dans la pleine opérationnalisation de cette opération. Nous venons d'identifier les différents créanciers qui vont adhérer à cette stratégie. Et nous voulons émettre des titres à maturité de 15 ans à coupon 0. Et nous allons faire des adjudications à l'envers, peut-être trimestriellement, selon la trésorerie du gouvernement. Ma question est de savoir, cette stratégie va débuter très bientôt, dans 3, 4, 6 mois. Et j'aimerais, en tant que gestionnaire, savoir quels sont les ABC, quels sont les pièges qui peuvent s'offrir devant nous, qu'est-ce qu'il faut éviter et quels conseils vous pouvez me donner. Merci.
Sorry, Dr. Wanko, do you want to take this one before we go forward? Yeah? So let him respond to this, then we'll take another batch, okay?
Thank you for those inspiring questions and comments. The first one had to do with, from Malawi, had to do with the challenge of crowding out the private sector by government. And how do we strike a balance? Yes, it's a real issue. I touched on it while I was presenting, but I didn't, of course, go into the details. It's a real issue. It's, again, an issue of sequencing and remixing. Sequencing in the sense that in the beginning, generally, the problem of crowding out wouldn't really arise because I assume that you are trying to develop the market, which didn't exist, both for the private sector and for the public sector. The market didn't exist. So initially, of course, the government goes full blast, Of course, it doesn't mean that companies are not going to markets to issue debentures, commercial papers, and all that. But those things happen on a sporadic scale. And and not well structured. And it's not like you have a program you can anticipate what's going to happen. So to that extent, at the beginning, that problem is minimal. However, naturally, as the market is not developed, or it starts developing, and even the government, the DMO, starts encouraging private sector to participate, that challenge necessarily arises. So the issue is, how do you balance? Because the problem is a good problem. It's not a bad problem, it's a good problem. In the sense that what he's saying that there are two big teams working to mobilize savings to develop the economy. So it's a good problem. So the issue is, how do you balance it so that the two teams, which are complements, actually, the two teams are complements. The private sector, they are complements. So if one is not doing well, the other wouldn't, and vice versa. So how to look at it is that as a debt manager, you start issuing. As soon as the private sector starts coming in, you start looking at the volume and the depth of the market. Based on your experience of the issuances you have made over the past 1 year, 2 years, before the private sector comes in full swing, you would have an idea of the depth of the market. If on an average, when you issue a bond and you look at the average subscription for the year, you find out that it has been 200, 250% subscribed. It means that beyond what government needs, there is still 1.5 times as much that the private sector can absorb without really causing a serious trade-off in the cost of funds. That's the implication. If, for example, on average, you issue 100 billion of your currency every month in your auctions, and on average, you find out that the subscription is always 300%. So people are asked for investors want to be able to buy 300 billion, whereas what you are looking for is 100 billion. So that shows you that even if the private sector comes, provided they're not asking for more than 200 billion within the same period, the crowding out would not materialize. At least that's a rule of thumb, right? Okay, so what it means that in terms of balance, you have something to guide you to balance. Does that make sense? Good. But beyond that also, beyond that, you'll be looking at, even with the excess, you'll be looking at the coupons, the marginal rates that result in the market. Okay? And you find out that from the marginal rate, that's the coupon, the price you eventually settle at, you find out that there's no real pressure on the cost of funds. That's again an indication that there is excess demand for the securities, which can be comfortably absorbed by private sector without a serious negative trade-off. So this will help you. Assuming then you reach a stage, theoretically, where the market can absorb 500, and somehow both the public and private sector are supplying debts of 700. So there's oversupply of securities. Okay? Then, of course, the challenge of overcrowding becomes real. Okay. Now, there are two ways to look at it. From absolute amount issued by the government, by the sovereign, as well as the timing of the issuances. The timing of the issuances. So one precaution for a debt manager to take under such circumstances is to have an idea of the private sector pipelines. You have an idea of the private sector pipelines. So in designing your auctioning program, you can be better informed so that the time you come to the market is not, as much as possible, is spaced away from the time the private sector is coming. particularly in terms of the volume you issue. Because ordinarily, you should have a monthly auction, okay? So you are not going to leave the market for 1 or 2 months because the private sector is going to issue for those months. But you might be influenced to reduce the volume you issue for those months where the private sector. Please, interpretation. There's complaint about interpretation. Not me, not me. Hello? Are you hearing me? Are you hearing? French, are you hearing? Are you hearing now, French? Are you hearing? Not yet. Are you hearing? You okay now? Okay. Okay. So you need to attempt to relate the volume of issuance per period, relate it to the expected, the pipelines from the private sector, so that there's minimum supply pressure. Because when there's supply pressure rises, then you expect the cost to rise. Okay, so those are some of the measures you can take. Beyond that, one of the ways intermediate to deal with that problem is the idea of creating new instruments. Because you can be sure that there will still be savings belonging to certain groups and classes of agents in the economy, whether households or firms, who are not interested in the type of instruments you are raising now. Now, when you now start issuing a sukuk, it becomes another way of you, government, for example, to raise money to satisfy its own need and reduce the pressure of supply on the conventional instruments. So, introducing new instruments is also a way of reducing the friction that comes from crowding out, or the friction that is in the form of crowding out. So there are certainly practical ways of doing as much as can be done. For example, at a stage, as I said, you find out that, okay, you need to ask the diaspora to start participating in the local currency market. It becomes another way of improving that was the point of investor base. The job on investor base is not done once and for all. It is done continuously. Even as you mature, you think in terms of whatever things that can be done to be able to bring in more funds into the system. Or how can the existing funds be adjusted to complement each other? Bearing in mind also that at a certain stage, government also might need to deliberately reduce its demand, its supply of debts to the market, so as to leave space for the private sector. If the DMO, if you calculate that, look, there's serious crowding out effect, and the overall for economy is not the best. So you take that strategic decision to decide to pull back and create more space for the private sector, because it's the same economy. You are interested in growing. So you're looking for the optimal way of growing it. And that optimal way changes from time to time, depending on the situation. On the issue of starting from those who are starting from the start, how could they do it? Again, it's the issue of sequencing. It depends on your situation. Remember, what we have done is generic, it's for everybody. But your peculiarity, we decide. Okay? Where you start, the peculiarity, we decide. Ghana has just given an example of the fact that there were even some serious activities, even before the formalization. In the case of Nigeria, as I gave an example, we started from the point of the fact that, look, there's a portfolio of public debt, domestic debt portfolio, and that portfolio is held by the central bank. And it is short-term debt. So already that gives us a starting point. Because remember, you want to develop the domestic debt market. Already you have some security available, some debts available, public debt available. So it makes sense to say, look, why don't we securitize the one that the central bank is holding, make it available to the market? Because you are trying to create a market. It's not in the market now. Central bank is not a market. It should not even be holding it. So it's not a market. So you are moving it from the entity holding it now to the market as the first step to developing the market. So as I was saying, in the case of Nigeria, and I understand that's exactly what happened with Ghana as well, that the Bank of Ghana was holding some bills, some government bills. So a natural starting point would be to move that existing debt from the central bank to the market. At that stage, using the banks, because you have not really opened up to the market where you start marketing the public and where the banks themselves start actively marketing the public, okay, other buyers. So usually you will approach the banks, they understand what you want to do, as I explained, and you do a book building then. It's a quasi-private placement, but still is an auction, but it's not thrown open to the extent that, for example, foreign investors can participate, because at this time we have not established the infrastructure, the communications, the guidelines for foreign participation and all that. So that would be a good starting point. Again, so you will look at your own situation. What is the status of public debt? Because even if there's no public debt office, there is already public, once there is a country, once there is public debt. So there must be debt somewhere. So look at the nature of the debt you have already. So that will give you an idea of where to start. So that is just a rule of thumb. So it depends. You must look at your own peculiarities and see, based on all this outline. Remember that all the sequence, some of these activities take place, if you like, in parallel. As you are doing this. Some of them have to wait for one aspect to be completed before it can come into play. But there are some that can be done simultaneously, okay, in terms of sequencing. But for a start, and that question is critical, bothering about how do you start? What is the takeoff? Is to examine your situation and knowing that this is your objective, you want to build the market. So invariably, you look at the state of your portfolio, and particularly the state of the money market. Because invariably, because banks exist, money market must be more advanced at that stage than the capital market. Because banks already exist, and the banks constitute essentially the money market with other players. So that also makes sense that whatever you are doing to start should depend heavily on banks who are already in the market, knowing that if you did, assuming theoretically you didn't have money market at all, you needed to establish a money market to be able to start going into the primary market of bonds and secondary market. Because you are talking of building a yield curve, and you are talking of bringing in the concept and practice of liquidity. And the concept and practice of liquidity must originate from the money market, because that's the market for short-term instruments, including short-term debts. Okay, so I guess this gives an indication. The third comment, let me make a correction. It's not, I didn't say DMO Nigeria started 2006. It started the year 2000. That's when it was established. It started operating in 2000. But the DMO Act did not come into being until 2003. The DMO Nigeria, that's just a historical fact.
Yeah, so I'm thinking for a country that is starting from the scratch to develop the market, would there be need for it to conduct some kind of an assessment to understand where it is, what is available, what is not available, before then they'll have a plan? If you can speak to that, sir.
Perfectly, you are right. But if we went back to the screen, that's exactly what he said. No, I don't know whether the screen is still working, but it doesn't matter. That's exactly what you said. You have to assess the market. You have to assess, and you have to plan. I mentioned it, you have to assess the portfolio and the market, what state, who is holding. We say, what instruments are already there? Who is holding them? What tenors? And you say, based on that, you have to plan what to do. And for each of the steps you are going to take, remember, you don't need to wait for the secondary market to be in place, for the money market to be in place. So when in the money market, what you are doing, even though if you have enough capacity, some team can be assessing for the future. But ideally, working within constraints or resources, what you expect to do is that you are doing, before, as you go into the money market, you assess what is to be done there and what is in place. That's the essence of that checklist or shopping list. Because these are the things that are supposed to make a money market work. So you will now know whether you have them in place already. So the assumption is that you don't have them already. But if you have them already, you tick them.
I mean, that is a very important point. In fact, it took months for us, including forming a committee. And some of the things that Prof mentioned, the dealership process, qualification for being a primary dealer, discussions with the stock exchange, floating the bond and all those. I think these were all steps. It's not something you just, move into. I think it should be a very comprehensive, deliberate process. And this is where I was saying that, we had even banks and others, because remember, as Prof said, you are opening up the market to them as well. They used to just go to the auction market, and which was mixed with Bank of Ghana's own OMO market, for just liquidity management and the rest. So it requires planning, and there is expertise. I believe that, the fund, departments and others were all, involved, in planning. It must be done carefully, because you are going to be also diluting the market, issues of crowding and others. So it requires elaborate planning. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, sir, for that beneficiation.
Somebody wants to add to it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I do have a question and maybe a comment about the local markets. I'm a debt manager from Somalia, and in Somalia, as most of you are aware of, and as we talked about yesterday, we got a debt relief of more than almost 4.5 billion to the foreign creditors. And still we do have, but that is comparing to what we have received, what have been relieved, is really minor. But what I'm thinking about, and it was really interesting, your lecture was, and the question the professor, the doctor posted was similar to that. We do have an experience when it comes to the borrowing from outside, from foreign creditors. But the domestic market, as far as I know, we don't have any borrowing from the domestic markets. There is no
bonds, no treasury bills, no sukuk, nothing. And it's really difficult how to regain the public trust in government. And I'm really worried how long that it will take us to, start building the domestic markets, and how we regain the public trust in government, to your opinion. Thank you.
Okay, I think I can. Remember, we have a series of questions already. So, but I'll jump on this because it goes straight to what we are discussing, right? It's not a new question. It was latching on the old question. When do you start?
Yeah, exactly.
So, in your own case, I think for the debt manager, the solution is even simple. Because the challenge is beyond debt management. The challenge is that the economy needs to reestablish itself, the economy itself. Because the debt management assumes that there's already an ecosystem that is operational to a certain level of effectiveness. And then you start doing certain things to make the economy get bigger and stronger. So in this case, the way to look at it is that everything that should be done from the political side, from the social side, from the security side, to reestablish a working system, overall working economic and social and political system should be in place first. Because it will be very dicey to go into this type of initiative, which requires, as you can see, it requires a lot of hard work, a lot of relationship building, a lot of trust building, a lot of interaction. So where the basic understanding is not already in place, it's going to be difficult to bring in a specialty to slot into that system and hope that it will work. Because you are not going to develop in the air. So it's to solidify the ground. So hope is not lost. There's always a beginning. So go ahead with other sectors, continue preparing, continue getting the expertise. Because even for countries that are not fragile, are not in transition, are relatively stable, you still have to start from think in terms of capacity building to take off. So there's nothing wrong, continue now to build capacity, understanding in the various components of the economy, including public debt management, while working with other groups in society to make sure that there is an ecosystem under which these new initiatives can be taken. So continue with the question from Morocco, or the contribution actually from Morocco, very rich contribution. Of course, Morocco is one of the most developed markets, domestic capital markets in Africa. So one point she made, which I should emphasize, is the issue that over time, when you start to find out the external debt may dominate the portfolio originally, that is the legacy debt. But still, to develop the domestic market, it is on the domestic component, no matter how small it is, that you are acting. And of course, over time, if you take the trajectory, like in the Nigerian case, you see that the domestic debt starts being bigger in proportion than the external debt, which has its own advantages and disadvantages. Because on the average, domestic cost of funds is higher than external cost of funds on the average. That is the interest, using the simple language, the interest rate you pay on domestic debt tends to be higher for most countries than the interest rate you pay on external debt. Okay, we are not talking of the exchange rate risk. We are talking of the nominal, if you converted what is good. Okay, so that's that. So which means over time, too, in terms of sequencing, there's a stage you will reach. You will now start convincing yourself in terms of a medium-term debt strategy that you should now start reducing the contribution, the share of domestic debt, and start increasing the share of external debt. Now, so many factors come into play. For example, you may have reached a stage that you have diversified your export base, that you are earning foreign exchange from at least 7 products, and that each of those products, you are not exporting them in raw form, you're exporting them in processed form. So you are comfortable that you have the foreign exchange revenue base to deal with your external liabilities. So there are many factors coming into play. Okay. Now, I was saying, in the case of Nigeria, the debt management was established in 2000, and DMO Act in 2003. It was in 2003 that the securitization of the legacy debt was effected. That is the one I say was moved from central bank to the market through the banks, the lending money banks. Okay? That was in 2003. Now, in terms of sequence, if you look at the graph of progress in Nigeria DMO, we found out that after that 2003, there was a gap. There was no issuance in 2004. That period was used to start planning based on the experience of the issuance that was done in 2003. For example, it was found out that while we issued 2- and 3-year bonds to securitize the CBN holding, the absorption of the 3-year bond was not enough. It was not adequate. So that gave us the impression that we needed to do more work to develop appetite for longer tenured bonds and to put other measures in place. So that goes to the fact that, yes, it takes time. These processes take time. So you don't do them overnight. It's one at a time. You achieve, and you know that you have some platform, some basis to move to the next step, you move. But you don't crowd it. And as you go, you monitor and know where the upward falls, so you can make changes, both in sequencing and in the quantum of activities you introduce per time. Now, the next, there was also the issue of hot money. That is foreign participation in the domestic debt market. Yes, that's a challenge. But it's a challenge that you find the best ways to manage depending on your own circumstances. Okay? Certainly, when foreign investors participate in the domestic debt market, it's part of the investor base that you are looking for. You want a more diversified investor base. But this particular type of investor comes with that risk of the extent that, particularly since there is a secondary market, anytime they perceive the economy negatively, they're likely to want to dump their securities in the market. And to do that, they have to have an impact in the foreign exchange reserves because they have to repatriate their money back, okay, through the market. So it's a challenge. Again, so as you move along, you have to consider what percentage participation of non-resident investors in foreign currency can you absorb comfortably? Is it 5% or 20%? Again, this is influenced, your decision, even if it is a nominal decision, is based on your perception of what your balance of payment looks like, what your foreign exchange diversification looks like, and what the volume looks like. So, which means when you are doing your risk assessment, you assess what percent, suppose foreigners have foreign currency participation in the domestic market is 20% of the total portfolio. If all of it goes out together, you can work out that with the central bank. Can the economy absorb the shock? So it starts giving you an indication of what level you reach and you play down on foreign participation, and where you will be, and you will encourage foreign participation with various measures. But certainly is a real problem. Can somebody give the phone to Madam and then to Joanne? Madam has been raising her hand, and then after her to Joanne, so that they can contribute. Thank you.
Concernant la question des taux d'intérêt qui sont plus élevés sur le marché domestique que le marché extérieur, est-ce que c'est bon? Non?
Yeah, please, the interpreter should up. Interpreter. Yeah,
Interpreter.
raise your volume, sir.
Comme ça.
Thank you.
Concernant les taux d'intérêt que vous jugez qui sont plus élevés sur le marché externe, sur le marché interne plus que les taux sur le marché interne, ça c'est pas le seul élément. Vous l'avez dit concernant les fluctuations du taux de change. Comme vous le savez, le Maroc aussi a expérimenté des problèmes de dette au cours des années 80. À cause de la dette extérieure. Il avait une dette extérieure élevée et à cause des fluctuations des taux de change, il a eu le programme d'ajustement structurel et il a souffert de ce programme. Après, il a décidé de développer le marché domestique. Et le marché des adjudications a été créé en 1989. C'était un marché très basique au départ. Il y a eu beaucoup de sophistication après. Au départ, il y avait cohabitation des instruments à taux administrés, des taux qui sont fixés par le ministère des Finances, et les taux des adjudications où il y a un appel d'offres et les soumissionnaires, et le Trésor il choisit les offres les plus intéressantes. Alors, pour revenir à la question des taux d'intérêt sur le marché domestique, effectivement, les taux d'intérêt domestiques étaient élevés. Mais après, avec le développement de la liquidité du marché, elle a permis d'avoir des taux d'intérêt bas. On se finance à des taux très bas, même sur les maturités très longues. Et puis, il y a la base des investisseurs. On a les compagnies d'assurance, les caisses de retraite qui participent à... Et il y avait aussi une question sur l'effet d'éviction. L'effet d'éviction, il y avait une question sur l'effet d'éviction du Trésor par rapport au secteur privé. Moi, j'ai une petite idée. Pourquoi? Parce que quand on a des développements d'infrastructures, il y a participation parfois des sociétés locales, et donc ça permet quelque part de réinjecter. Et aussi, quand on paie la dette, on réinjecte dans l'économie, même si le flux, c'est plutôt dans l'autre sens. Merci.
Merci. Moi, c'est Étienne Ndikomana de la République du Burundi. Moi, j'ai donc j'ai deux questions. Vous avez parlé du fonctionnement des courtiers sur le marché primaire et secondaire. Comment est-ce que ces courtiers interviennent sur le marché? Comment ça fonctionne dans les... Bon, vous pouvez nous dire par rapport aux expériences des autres pays, comment les courtiers fonctionnent sur le marché secondaire? Ma deuxième question, if you understand, ma deuxième question porte effectivement sur le thème qui fait objet de notre session, le développement et approfondir le marché de la dette intérieure en Afrique. Par rapport à votre présentation, lorsqu'on précise le souci de développer le marché intérieur, l'idée derrière, c'est d'abord assurer le cadre macroéconomique du pays. Parce que si le cadre macroéconomique du pays n'est pas assaini, on ne parvenait pas à développer le marché intérieur. Parce qu'en certains moments, même dans votre présentation, l'acteur principal, vous savez que ce sont les banques commerciales. Si en certains moments, les banques commerciales ne disposent pas des épargnes internes qui sont suffisantes, on aura des difficultés de développer le marché de la dette intérieure. Bon, je pose cette question par rapport à la situation que nous vivons au Burundi, parce qu'actuellement, il y a il y a la dette intérieure qui prend une allure inquiétante parce que le financement du déficit est généralement couvert par l'endettement intérieur, mais actuellement, on se rend compte qu'il y a une faible absorption des banques pour répondre aux besoins de l'administration. À ce moment, quel est le comportement que devrait prendre le gestionnaire de la dette face à cette situation? Parce qu'il y a les banques à un certain moment qui ne parviennent pas à assurer convenablement l'absorption du besoin compte tenu du cadre macroéconomique qui n'est pas du tout assaini. Il y a l'épargne interne qui est un peu faible. C'est ça mes deux questions. Merci.
Thank you very much. I just want to make a few comments regarding developing debt capital market or domestic markets. So, and I want to add another pillar. We have 6 pillars. The first pillar, or what actually should be the foundation of developing market, is sound macroeconomic policies. And so it's very difficult to develop the market, and as my previous colleague was mentioning, the soundness of the financial system. So, but you don't have to wait until it's perfect. You can start developing because, as you mentioned, things takes time, and 10 years in the life of a debt manager is very short. So, if government do too much borrowing, of course the banks, because there's only so much demand. So it's whatever the supply, it's a question of supply and demand. So, and that is also some of the analysis that debt officers should do. What is the demand for my paper out there? Is there enough demand? If I'm going to issue too much debt, of course there will be a counter-reaction from banks, and you will have most probably undersubscribed auctions. So it's always a question of macroeconomic policy, fiscal and monetary policy, your inflation rate. I mean, is that when your inflation rate is 23 or 20%, it becomes a problem. It's a big problem. But what is it? So it's a whole environment, financial environment, to stabilize. At the end of the day, that will make the environment conducive for issuing your bonds. So why is domestic bond markets important? Is because, and I will talk about cash management later this afternoon, is that governments need cash on a regular basis. And the only market that can supply government with a continuous funding is the domestic market. The other markets, if you go to the foreign market, it takes time. You issue a Sukuk bond or whatever every 3 years or so it's important of a domestic market is that you can have regularly on a monthly basis, on a weekly basis, when whatever your requirements are, you can tap that market. So and it's important to have your risk in your local market. That is just something that I want to emphasize. And don't be discouraged of trying to do what, start small, and then over the years, as I said, in South Africa, it took 5 years for us to introduce electronic trading platform. It's something that you just need to continue doing the right thing at the right time going forward. And as long as you're on that track, on the next step that you know you need to take, in terms of what will work for your country, don't be discouraged what other countries have done in this perspective, is that at the end of the day, you work at the pace that you know your country can accommodate. Thank you.
Prof, just a quick compliment. Again, from my experience, there is a positive side to, to crowding. Ironically, we were doing, in fact, by the time we went to the market, we had floated through the bank 3-year and 5-year bonds. So they were part of what, we offloaded. Our TB rate was around 24%. The market rate itself was around 30%, 33, close to 30 plus. But gradually, as government became liquid, and again, going to yesterday's point on the TSA, which we also took, seriously, we had two objectives. The TB rate dropped to 16% within 2 years. But it wasn't just the domestic market. In fact, we had also done the World Bank bond to exclusively refinance, the bonds for 15 years to be supported, with a repayment mechanism. This has the macroeconomic effect, I would say, is that if you are issuing, government bonds and banks are lending at 30% thereabout, it is itself nothing to write home about. So the flotation and the liquidity, of funds that were held captive contributed positively to a reduction, in the interest rates, generally. So there's a complementarity, there. But you don't also have to redeem 100%. That became my experience, because Ghana was B+ and slipped to B-. So one of our goals for refinancing and repayment of both the domestic, and the external bond was to keep a floor of about 55 and a ceiling at 65, and then in the medium term to drop it to 60 and then 50. That means that you are only watching, the excess that is keeping you outside these bonds, these bands. And that is where you go to the markets to intervene. And then gradually, as you begin to improve your ratings, and I'm linking this to ratings, because we were looking at all these factors. And in fact, the technical advice was comprehensive and covered all these. As I said, in fact, the World Bank Treasury was part of even the discussion, because we were then doing the partial risk, guarantee and the World Bank bond, that is impaired today. So I think we need to have multiple objectives in view and balance them, as Prof said. A focus on a single one might not. Now, there was also a policy where we channeled concessional financing for social infrastructure, because as a middle-income country, they were dwindling. And then we started channeling commercial lending as a middle-income country to self-financing projects. And that's what I was telling some, a group yesterday. One example is the Terminal 3, which was financed by the airport tax. So ring fence, and government didn't have to issue a guarantee, and all the headaches, that come with it. So the market itself should be part of a larger, debt management, strategy, where you are looking at various things and juggling them. And then having a committee. We had an oversight committee involving the Bank of Ghana. They had experience as the central bank, our Ministry of Finance, Budget and Debt, divisions, who were always monitoring. And the committee, we brought in the commercial banks, because they were also the major primary dealers, and they were the ones who were also acting on behalf of, their customers in floating the bonds and the bills. So I just want to compliment this. That you need to have a total fiscal strategy, including TSA, as has been said, to make government itself liquid so that you can achieve your goals.
Thank you very much. Based on these comments, before we go to additional comments, based on these comments, I'm sure all of us understand that the emphasis the contributors have made. One of them is the fact that you need a sound macroeconomic environment. You know, as I said when I was making the presentation, there are things you take for granted. Take for granted means those things, we assume they are in place. It's much like the question one of us asked about the state of his country and how feasible and reasonable is it to embark on this project of domestic debt management, okay? And we answered that yes, you should start making preparation. But let us appreciate that there are basic things that have been assumed to be operative within the economy, functional. And it's on the basis of that you are building. So yes, important macroeconomic stability, macroeconomic soundness, very critical. Relating to that particularly is also the issue of monetary policy, because most of the things we are discussing relate also to the cost of funds. And the cost of funds, you are talking about the price you will pay, which is an interest rate. But of course, you know that the most important interest rate in the economy would be decided by the central bank. And invariably, much other interest rates revolve around it in one form or the other. So, which means how the monetary authorities are moving is also relevant. And that's why, just as the Honorable Minister has mentioned, that's why, and that case is also part of my presentation, one of the responsibilities of the debt manager is to ensure that the relevant committees are in place. One of these committees is the Bond Market Steering Committee. So the development of the debt market is championed, is led by the Debt Management Office. But there are many other members that are very critical. So that's why you need to have a Bond Market Steering Committee, where the membership includes the lending money banks. It includes the Securities and Exchange Commission. It includes the central bank and some other players in the system. So it's an important point to note that most of the job you do, part of it is to initiate the establishment of relevant committees, interministerial and intersectoral, so that you'll be speaking the same language on the issue, and so that there's a minimum level of harmonization. It doesn't mean that the central bank has to be listening to the fiscal authority, but there has to be some handshake somewhere, because it's the same economy. So I think that's the point that is being soundly made.
Yes, thank you very much. I really like the intensity of the engagement. But let's try to aim to finish this session by 1 p.m. so that we can go for lunch. When we come back, we can continue. So you take as much of the responses as you can. We'll go for lunch by 1. When we come back, we'll continue. Okay? But somebody has something.
No, let me round up. Then
maybe when you come back.
Let me round up. Because I'm commenting on the comments, because the comments are very rich. Okay? And I'm sure they will preempt other questions, because the comments that I made cover almost everything. And we are talking of pricing, interest rate, and all that, crowding out effect, and the relative cost of external and domestic borrowing, which Morocco was emphasizing. Also, let us appreciate that when you want to develop your domestic debt market, you may find out that in reality, in real terms, the domestic cost of funds is higher, even when you take into account exchange rate implications. Your domestic cost of funds may be higher. But does that mean you should not develop the market? No. Because you are not simply considering only the financial cost. You are taking into account other factors, other benefits, such as Joan mentioned, the fact that you are developing a ready source of money. Anytime government needs money, there's a ready market. If I want to go and borrow from the international capital market, issue a Euro bond, I'm sure it won't take me, on average, it takes at least 3 months if you have been in the market several times. To repeat, you may need, but initially it may take you up to 6 months, for example, to do all the documentation, all the marketing, all the roadshows. Okay, so but this is a market that's ready. So when you take it into account, in terms of cost benefit, you can find out that even though in nominal terms, the domestic cost of fund is 10%, okay? External, it is 5%. You may still decide that it is beneficial for you to borrow domestically until you develop the domestic debt market. Of course, when you reach a certain stage, you then start seeing how you can rebalance backwards or how you can use various methods to improve the liquidity and savings in the economy so that the cost won't be too high. So those are the various things to consider. But there was a question from DRC which was overtaken by the comments. And he was talking about they have a lot of areas, how to deal with them. Now, it depends on the type of areas you have. For example, suppose there are local contractor debts, if they're not being held by central bank. If the government has contracted for various jobs, the jobs have been done, but they have not been able to pay. So these become debts. They are public debt, but they have not been securitized. They are contractor debts. So ordinarily, they are administrative debts, debts incurred by ministry departments and agencies, not debt incurred by debt management office making an offer for subscription. Do you understand? Now, that debt, what you do now as a debt manager, as part of the starting point, is to convert that contractor's debt into a documented public debt. So it becomes part of your public debt portfolio. So when World Bank or anybody sees your debt portfolio, it will now be this. But when it is in the ministry, scattered as expenses they incurred, which they have not paid, it's not actually recognized and it's not really aggregated. So how do you do it? So you have to find a way of selling these contractors' debts to the market as sovereign bonds. So you use the proceeds to clear the arrears, and then you have new debtors in the market. Of course, one of the essence of developing the market is to subject the government to the discipline of the market. So in this case, you have converted those debts, which relatively administrative, they are now the pure domestic debt of the government. They are sovereign debts with the qualities attached to sovereign debts. So that's what you can do under such a circumstance, assuming it's contractor's debt. But it applies mutatis mutandis to any other type of debt that is existing that has not been formalized, documented as recognized public debt of the country. So what I'm trying to say, yes, there are many ways you can handle arrears. There can be a starting point, just the way you treated the debts held by, because indeed, in practical terms, the debt held by central bank are actually arrears. Because ordinarily, by the rules of almost all central banks, any money the central bank lends to a government is supposed to be liquidated in the same financial year. That's what it's supposed to be. So it's because there's no alternative. Government continues rolling over, and central banks continue underwriting more and more of government debts. So in practical terms, those are actually arrears. And that's why you securitize them to migrate them to the market, competitive market. So you find the principle of migrating those arrears to the competitive market. I think we have attempted to look at the issues. If there are residual issues, we will continue later. Thank you very much for your very rich responses.
Once again, if I may share our experience, Ghana had, some of you may have heard about the wage overruns, which we were calling single spine. What happened was that there was to be public sector restructuring of the salaries, and it resulted, the pilot, the implementation went out of alignment with the pilot, and it resulted in huge, government commitments and debt, which had been made because some civil servants were paid. So we were issuing bonds to pay the arrears. It was increasing the debt. So what we did was to negotiate with labor, those who had been paid, to be paid the balance over a period of 3 years, whilst their current salary would be met. Now, these bonds were the 3 and 5 year bonds, partially, which I was talking about. So sometimes you have to get a mix, and creating such a market gives you opportunity to look at all your debt instruments. So we approached the World Bank and got a 1 billion debt. Our first sovereign bond, which was 2007, around about 2014, was also due in 3 years. So we bundled all this together and then spread it over, use the bond to refinance it and stretch the repayment over 15 years with soft amortization, with a view to setting up the repayment sinking fund to take them off, from our own resources, which would have been, much easier. So yes, as Prof is saying, it's an opportunity for you to look back on, the past. And in fact, the current IMF program that Ghana is going through to try and get out of it, there is such a thing also where amount owed to some creditors in the power and road sector have been bundled, and actually converted from arrears to debt, which is supposed to be, serviced as part of the debt restructuring, haircut, and other things that's going on. So, I mean, this is a very rich engagement. It gives us, how to combine your various, as Prof said, your macroeconomic, your macro fiscal and other issues together with, and let me emphasize, TSA, because government money is used haphazardly all over the place. In fact, the worst of it is that government money in banks can be used to come and buy your own T-bills, your own money. When you do TSA, you manage to get that. So whilst you are getting liquid, you're also controlling your arrears, and your debt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, can we give the contributors, the participants, a round of applause?